welcome to Breaking Dimension.
So we're going to move from the microscopic, from Franz's talk, to my talk is going to be macroscopic. And when I heard that the theme was bold visions, I decided to really be bold. And so basically this is going to be about how integrating psychedelics into our culture can play a major role in helping save and sustain the world for future generations. So I'm going to be talking about psychedelics and the future united religions. Building a global spirituality. There's been a lot of concerns I've heard about how MAPS's vision to work on medicalizing psychedelics, to make them into prescription medicines, is on the one hand narrow, and on the other hand maybe like endorsing a medical priesthood. And I'd like to show you by this talk today that that's really part of a much larger vision that we have to bring about a much better world. And I think there's strategic reasons to be working on medicalizing psychedelics, but it's not only is it not the biggest part of the picture, but it is, I think, a necessary stepping stone towards what we'll be talking about. And so what I'm going to focus on is the political implications of the mystical experience and the mainstreaming of psychedelics. Why is it worth so much of our lives, so much of our time to really try to mainstream psychedelics? We could have our own individual experiences, and many of us have had them, but I think there's something deeper to be gained by really trying to mainstream them. Now, when I was growing up, I had this sort of intimation that there was something connected between psychedelics and sort of this movement towards a more peaceful world. This is a picture of John and Lennon on their honeymoon, and Tommy Smothers is playing the guitar, and Tim Leary is there. And this sort of illustrates in one image the whole psychedelic 60s and how there was this major link between sort of the psychedelic community and these larger social movements, which of course did help lead, unfortunately, to the backlash that we're just now emerging from. Now, the idea that mental changes are necessary for a more peaceful world is not new. This was right after World War II. The preamble to the UNESCO Constitution says, "Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed." And Albert Einstein spoke and said, "The splitting of the atom has changed everything save our mode of thinking, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe." And so I think we need to ask ourselves, what does he mean by our mode of thinking, and what sort of a shift is he trying to point us to? And I think it's a shift towards a more universalistic understanding, more of a unit of experience, very much contained in the mystical experience. And as long as we think of ourselves as separate individuals identified by our culture, our religion, our country, our race, our gender, any number of these different ways that we think of ourselves, that we'll still find ourselves in conflict, and we have to understand something much deeper about our unity. And so with this, the risks, of course, that Einstein saw were Hiroshima. We see it now with the nuclear crisis. Even when we try to control some of these forces in peaceful ways, it's still really difficult. It has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity. And I think for me, when I was young and first starting to do LSD, I felt like I was overdeveloped intellectually and underdeveloped emotionally and spiritually, and I felt the same about the culture. And I think this is, again, what Einstein is talking about. And we have the worst examples, among the worst is Auschwitz, Vietnam. And yet, now we have Dr. Stan Grof talking about LSD is to the study of the mind what the telescope is to astronomy and the microscope is to biology. So this is a further hint that there is something in psychedelics that will really be key to understanding how to make these changes in the minds of mankind. And this connection, again, between spirituality and psychedelics and science was really pioneered by Walter Pahnke. And we heard about it in Roland's talk a bit, the Good Friday experiment, which was conducted in 1962 at Harvard. This is one of the best things that Timothy Leary ever did. He was the faculty sponsor for this. It took place in Marsh Chapel. And to give you an idea of how it's possible for psychedelics to be integrated and mainstreamed, again, we should just look back. And when the Good Friday experiment took place, it was in this chapel on Good Friday, and the minister was Reverend Howard Thurman, and he was the mentor for Martin Luther King, who was getting his PhD at the same time here at Boston University. Now, we heard this again from Roland, the key criteria of a mystical experience, and we're going to look how does this, the sense of unity, both internal and external, the transcendence of time and space, the sense of sacredness, the sense of objective reality, the numinous quality, the deeply felt positive mood, the ineffability and paradoxicality. This is sort of the core. How does this have political implications? Well, the first part is that the Good Friday experiment looked 6 months out after the experiment and did follow-ups and assessed people's changes in attitudes and behavior, and changes towards self, changes towards others, changes towards life, and changes towards the experience. And that they found that people felt that there was something that was persisting from that experiment, that something that was positive and helped them lead, in some ways, a better life. Now, flash forward to 1982, and I came across this book in 1983. Robert Mueller was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. In a sense, he was the mystic at the UN. And he wrote this book, New Genesis, Shaping a Global Spirituality. And his basic idea was that we have the United Nations to help us mediate conflicts between nations, but so many of the conflicts go deeper, and they go into religion. And he felt that we really needed a united religions. And that's what he's starting to talk about in terms of global spirituality. And it was a very persuasive book, but there wasn't a single word in it about psychedelics. And so I decided that as a young undergraduate, I would write him a letter and just talk to him about the Good Friday experiment and basically say that he made a terrific point. I understood his arguments, but since every new method of killing people gets unlimited money practically from the defense establishments, the war establishments around the world, would he be willing to use his political situation, his context, to help start psychedelic research? Because we had evidence from the Good Friday experiment and thousands of years of religious use of psychedelics that there was some connection here. And so whether it was a genuine spiritual experience or whether it was a similar to a genuine spiritual experience, certainly for the importance that he put on developing this global spirituality, he should be willing to help start psychedelic research. And I mentioned to him that MDMA was a legal substance and that it would be possible to do research with that. And to my utter surprise, he actually wrote me back. And he said that he agreed, that I understood what he was saying, and he agreed with my argument, and he would help with trying to bring back psychedelic research. And then he gave me a list of various people that he wanted me to consult with who were religious professionals in a range of different religions. So reading between the lines, I read, he wants me to send them MDMA. and so I proceeded to do so. And then they proceeded to report back to him what their experiences were. One of them was Wayne Teasdale, who later wrote A Monk in the World. And he was a Roman Catholic monk who was very starting to get very politically active. So he was one among many that I communicated with. And I felt, again, this thesis that somehow the mystical experience, psychedelics, and people working on political change was really being validated. Now, I worked with Robert Mueller a little bit. It'll be hard for you to see this, but this was something I wrote in 1984. This was like a dream protocol that I would one day still like to conduct. And basically what it says is that if we can get 50 people who are from 5 different religions, 10 in each religion, who are studying to be religious professionals, and they have whatever their training program is, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, to become a rabbi, to become a priest, whatever it is, that we would take half of these people and they would go through the normal process, and then the other half would be supplemented with psychedelic experiences. And then at the end of the process, we would do a lot of personality tests, a whole series of tests to compare the people who were trained with psychedelics and then trained without psychedelics in the normal way. And then what we would do is a second study that would look at helping to look at the visions that people had, the content of their psychedelic experience, and then compare the content that they had with the symbol systems of their own religion, just to see how, and what we would predict actually now is that people will have a range of experiences that may not be limited to the symbol systems of their own particular religion. Some of my more meaningful experiences, one with Ibogaine was very much involved with a lot of images of Jesus on the cross. It was a difficult Ibogaine experience. And so the third level of analysis would be to look at the visions and the experiences of the people in the different religions and then compare them to each other and to see, is there evidence that we can gather about this common mystical core? Is that really the case? Can we really see that? And it's often been said that the mystics of the different religions have more in common with each other than they do with the fundamentalists in their own religion. And I think we see that the fundamentalists in the different religions, it's almost the same kind of mental approach that they have. Doesn't matter really which religion it is. So what we're kind of saying is we need to help people move from a fundamentalist perspective to more of a mystical perspective. And if we can do that, we'll avoid a lot of the conflicts that come from sort of the fundamentalists each saying they've got the one right way. And so this was a study. We actually, I cased the joint. I went to the UN and tried to figure out where on the UN property, since it's technically not in the United States, it's its own little area, where could we actually conduct this experiment? And I identified a place, but it was way too ambitious for the time. There was no way to do it. Psychedelic research was being blocked in the United States and everywhere else around the world. So I wasn't able to do it. But what I was able to do was a long-term follow-up to the Good Friday experiment. Because basically that didn't involve administering drugs. That just involved asking questions of people who had been administered drugs. And in the mystical literature, the real test, you can see that we can evaluate on many different dimensions what kind of experience people have. But the real test is the fruits test. What are the implications of the experience to people's lives? You judge by the fruits. And so people who have had 25 years now to reflect on it, and at the same time that I was asking them in the midst of an escalation of the war on drugs, the Nancy Reagan just say no era. And so if they had any incentive to sort of turn their back and deny that what they had had was genuine, I was asking them at a time when they would be more likely to do that. But what I found was that the people who had the mystical experience from psilocybin felt that it was still genuine, and they had had, many of them, non-drug mystical experiences with which to compare. They generally preferred the non-drug mystical experiences because they were more uniformly positive, whereas the drug experiences oscillated between moments of fear, moments of terror, challenges of letting go, but they considered them to be the doorway to their future mystical life for many of them. Some of them had mystical experiences before that. All of these people were in training to be Christian ministers. And what they reported was an enhanced appreciation of life and nature, deepened sense of joy, deepened commitment to the Christian ministry or to whatever other vocations the subjects chose, enhanced appreciation of unusual experiences and emotions, increased tolerance of other religious systems, deepened equanimity in the face of difficult life crises, and greater solidarity and identification with foreign peoples, minorities, women, and nature. And so I felt here now was the confirmation for me that this was the right area for me to focus my energies on, and that this really, there was something to this idea that sort of blossomed in many people's minds in the 60s. Now, in 1988, Wayne Teasdale and others, here he is with the Dalai Lama, they worked to establish what they called the Council for the Parliament of the World's Religions. And this was inspired by the 1893 Parliament of the World's Religions at the Chicago World's Fair. It was the largest ecumenical gathering to have taken place in the world at that time in 1893. And so Wayne and others who had both been inspired by their mystical practices and also by their psychedelic experiences worked to commemorate this 100th anniversary, and they created this Council for the Parliament of the World's Religions. It's still a live organization. The next meeting that they're going to have, they have them every 5 years now, is going to be 2014 in Brussels. They're expecting around 10,000 people to come. So this is a small organization, relatively, but it's the seed that I think is going to be growing over time to really help us navigate moving through this globalization process where religions and peoples and nations, we're all bumping up against each other, and we have to learn how to live together and see our common nature. And here's what they say, and I think this is really important. The Council for a Parliament of the World's Religions seeks to promote interreligious harmony rather than unity. The problem with seeking unity among religions is the risk of loss of the unique and precious character of each individual religious and spiritual tradition. This understanding is key to our framework. It's the appreciation of diversity. It's not the blending of everything into one homogeneous, world government, world religion, but it's the appreciation of the unique and different perspectives. The Council has initiated dialogues and nurtured relationships among people of difference. In doing so, the Council has provided a framework for expressing many visions of a just, peaceful, and sustainable future. In the process, religious and spiritual communities have discovered a shared commitment to ethical principles. This shared commitment has opened the way for a new era of cooperative action among the world's religious and spiritual communities, as well as civil and political societies. And this is how they end. The well-being of the earth and all life depends on this collaboration. And I think there is that sense that really we have to all bind together. The challenges have become so great for the human species that it's going to take all of us to really find our ways out. Now, how are we going to have these experiences? One of the ways, of course, is to expand the freedom of religion so that those people who use psychedelics within their religious practice are able to do so. And there's been some tentative moves, promising moves in that direction. The U.S. Supreme Court protects the peyote use by the Native American Church. There's 500,000 members of the Native American Church in the United States legally using peyote in their ceremonies. The Supreme Court has also protected ayahuasca use by the União de Vegetal, and there are now cases about protecting the Santo Daime use as well. Brazil, Peru protects religious use of ayahuasca, and who knows, there's legal cases, as we've heard at this conference, that is coming up in England. And in Gabon, they protect the religious use of iboga in the Bwiti religion. So there are some moves in this area. And probably from our Western culture, the best example was the Eleusinian Mysteries. For 2,000 years, they were sort of the foundation ceremony of the Greek culture. They were ended in 396 by the Catholic Church, who saw them as a competitive kind of a source of strength. This was about individuals' direct relationship, and the Church wanted to be the mediator between people and their spirituality. And for what we know about it, it seemed to work for most everybody that participated in it. But now, a lot of these ritual rites of passage that we have in our religions, they don't seem to work for most people. So for me, my bar mitzvah did not turn me into a man. I anticipated that it would. This was from a great movie, A Serious Man, by the Coen brothers, where he smokes pot right before his bar mitzvah. And he's the dazed and scared look in his eyes. So I think that we are entering a situation where, for many of us, the rites of passage have lost their potency. But we also need freedom from religion. And by that I mean that each individual has a fundamental human right to explore and express their personal spirituality outside of religious contexts. Religions are groups, and we need to protect individual direct spirituality. And individual spiritual use is not protected by freedom of religion. And to get there, it requires legalization of some sort for access to psychedelics outside of organized religious, medical, and scientific contexts. So that's what I'm trying to say. The medicalization of psychedelics, even religious freedom, is only going to get us part of the way there towards having this individual right for people to express their own spirituality if they choose through the use of psychedelics. And I would like to say, in some senses, that I think Roland's research is more revolutionary than what MAPS is doing, because what he has shown, and his research makes the best case for drug legalization than any of our other studies, because what he has shown is that individuals, not in a religious setting, not part of a religious community, and not in the midst of a religious practice, can have one of the most profound spiritual experiences of their lives. And so we have to say, what are the implications of that? It really, again, suggests that we have to go beyond freedom of religion to some sort of legalization for adults. Now, here's the theory of social change to mainstream psychedelics. And it's basically about shifting the balance from fear to hope. Most of the drug education programs that are going on, the drug abuse prevention education programs, focus on increasing perceived risk, which is different from actual risk, and on harm maximization, so that the policies that we have try to make it worse for people who decide to use drugs. And it's an intentional approach to try to increase the perceived risk. One of the biggest findings of the surveys that have been done over the last 30 years or so in the United States by the National Institute on Drug Abuse is that there's a relationship between perceived risk going up and drug use going down. So the more that there is a perceived risk about a drug, the more use. Now, in this context too, use is the same as abuse. So this analysis is really a muddy kind of analysis. Use equals abuse. So the more we can do to get perceived risk up, from their perspective, the better. And that's why psychedelic research has been perceived of as such a threat, because we are trying to get balanced information about both risks and benefits. And when you do that, it runs up against a lot of the drug education efforts, which are really unbalanced and biased and exaggerate the risks and deny the benefits. So how can we shift the balance from fear to hope? And that's where I think the role of the medicalization of psychedelics plays a major role. But not just medicalization, we need to do the whole range of drug development, preclinical toxicity studies, phase 1 safety studies, mechanism of action studies, using psychedelics to probe consciousness. Eventually, we're going to try to hope to start psychedelic research into creativity, to problem solving, to in businesses and scientific areas. There was great research like that in the 60s and 50s about psychedelics and creativity, and drug development and therapeutic applications. And I think the work with the end of life is, in some ways, again, the most important, because we are all going to be dying. And this is an article about a mother contacted the Boston Globe about the underground psychedelic therapy treatment of her daughter who died in her early 30s of cancer, and it was shown in the Boston Globe as a good death. To the extent that we can help people get over their fear of death and help them realize that there are ways to have a good death, and this is basically what the hospice movement is doing, that we can overcome a lot of people's fears and open their hearts and open their willingness to give permission for psychedelic research. So I think the end of life is broad and it reaches all of us. And to give you a sense of how much progress we've been making through this medicalization, through working on trying to find therapeutic applications, particularly with MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a video from 10 years, this is an image from 10 years ago. This was on Oprah's TV show. And she did a show on ecstasy. I was working with her staff. It kept getting more and more complex. And then her staff said, well, it's so complex, they're going to do 2 shows. one on the risks and one on the benefits. And as it turned out, the first show was going to be the risks, and as it turned out, there was no show on the benefits. But this was what they showed. This is a completely graphically manipulated SPECT scan where every area that had activation below a certain level wasn't shown in a different color, it was shown as a whole. So this image has sort of made it around the world, and I just encountered people in Australia in December and Israel in January who were telling me that they were scared about ecstasy, MDMA causing holes in their brains. This is another image. Now, if you saw this, this is a pretty scary image. And again, it increases perceived risk. So what we've sort of been able to counter that with is Mdma-Assisted psychotherapy for PTSD with pilot studies in all of these countries or efforts to start them. So we had a meeting on Friday, Ben Sessa and Peter Owen and myself and Verena with the Wellcome Trust to see if they might be open to applications to support MDMA PTSD research. So that's why we have the British flag here. And they actually said that they would be willing to let us, they would entertain an application, that they're more interested in the mechanisms than in the therapy, but that while it might be a reputational risk, they could acknowledge that it could also possibly be a reputational opportunity. So we work with highly sympathetic patient populations with veterans, and these are the kind of images that now we're getting. This was from an Israeli newspaper. This is a fellow who is a soldier, blood red C, and the happy face ecstasy pill is his lifesaver. This is like one of the best images we had ever had at the time. This was in the Washington Post, the peace drug. Now, we are trying to sort of go for peace in a way. We're doing a study in Israel, and we've tried to start a study in Jordan as well. The Jordanians have said that they're not in the place where we can talk about Israeli-Arab cooperation in terms of MDMA research, but they said as long as we frame it as the Jordanians are competing with the Israelis, that they'll be okay with that. So now we have a competition in the Middle East for who can do the best therapy with MDMA. And last Tuesday, we heard from a meeting at the Jordanian FDA that they were going to approve the protocol in 4 to 6 weeks after we submit a few more easy documents. Now, we've also, to give you an example of how this works, in building relationships with the Jordanians, one of the psychologists that's working on the study is the psychologist for the Jordanian counterterrorism forces. And he's also going to be the therapist on the MDMA PTSD study. And so trying to, again, find these bridges, I remarked that I really respected the Sufis. I was searching for a Muslim group that I knew about that I could say I really appreciated. And his first response was, the Sufis are not terrorists. So I think, again, and they tend to be the mystical core of the Muslim religion. In some areas of the Arab world, they're persecuted against severely. But in other worlds, particularly in Jordan and others, they're protected. Now, by working with the military, this is going to trace through society how we've been able to get our message out. I gave an exclusive to military.com. It's 10 million members of this website, current and former members of the U.S. military and their families. And because we're talking about working with MDMA with veterans, they were willing to really write it up and put it on their homepage and help out. So military.com started it out. Then it went to Fox News, owned by Murdoch. But because it came from the military, they reported it in a really positive way. Then it was on the Navy SEALs website. Then it was on a newsletter that went to the medical profession. Then it was in Time magazine. And now, in this month's issue of Elle magazine, there's an article about the psychedelic renaissance and the potential of MDMA for couples therapy. Of course, they say at the bottom, fighting all the time, a new drug can help you, and it's not Viagra. But it's a really positive article. And I think that when we look at the fear of parents, mothers and fathers, for their children is what's primarily driving the drug war now. It's no longer psychedelics as symbol of cultural rebellion, although that is there as well. Going back to the picture of John and Yoko, we have that sense from the 60s, but that's been fading. So trying now for us, we have an active effort to reach out to the mothers, the fathers, the families. And this is Oprah's magazine, O Magazine. And this was last month's. Can a single pill heal your pain? And to give, now, keep in mind now, I'm going to show you an image from this article. Keep in mind the holes in the brain. This is where we've come to. This is a magic pill that will, now this is, of course, propaganda in the positive direction. You know, we don't say that a single pill will do it. We don't say that it'll work for everybody. But for this kind of imagery to be put out by Oprah's magazine 10 years after the biased and graphically manipulated brain scans, it's really remarkable. So we're moving towards medicalization. This is from the study at Harvard that we helped start with MDMA for cancer patients. We're moving to medicalize it. The vision is that eventually there'll be psychedelic clinics like this throughout the world. In 1974 was the first hospice center. And in 2004, 30 years later, there was 3,500 hospice centers. So once we get MDMA as a medicine, psychedelics as a medicine, we can expect a generation or so of rollout into the society. And then we'll have, this is Google Maps. This is where all the psychedelic clinics are in the future. And the clinics, and this is the kind of vision really, is that the clinics will start to treat patients. They'll be highly trained professionals who will be specially licensed, who will work most likely in special facilities as well. But then eventually they'll expand as culture gets more and more comfortable, and they'll expand to family members of the people who are being treated. If you have a spouse that's dying, you might not have clinical anxiety or depression, but you have a lot of things to work through. So I think eventually it'll expand to family members. And then I think the vision can be that once we move towards legalization, it doesn't have to be like anybody could buy it. I think the clinics would become a site of initiation. And the best way to think about this is like when you go get your driver's license, you have to actually drive under supervision of somebody who says what you can do may eventually endanger yourself or others, so we have to have a certain kind of skill level. So I think people will go to these clinics, they will have an experience. If they don't have some catastrophic outcome, they will get a license that would permit them to purchase it on their own and then use it wherever they so choose. So this is the vision for me of moving from medicalization to broader legalization, and then eventually we will also get what's called the parental override, because many people, many of us here have started use of psychedelics when we were younger than 21 or younger than 18. So in most cultures that have successfully integrated psychedelics have opportunities for the young people to be exposed to smaller and smaller but eventually growing doses, and that's done in a family context, in a spiritual context. So I think we will end up giving parents the right, instead of the government, to permit their own children to have access to psychedelics if they want to. And the model is not so strange. In the United States right now, 23 states permit parents to introduce alcohol to their children. So that we already have that idea that parents should be the place. So this is a family values strategy, saying that families should be in charge more of children than the government, which just says no. Now, once we do this with this vision, people will be using psychedelics in all different contexts. Some will be religious, some will be therapeutic, some will be private homes, but some will also be large-scale festivals. And we have to be implementing, and we're already starting to do that, harm reduction, or here we call it cosmic care. This is the best example in the world. This is Boom Festival, 2010, and the organizers of the Boom Festival spent 30,000 euros to create a place for people who are having difficult psychedelic experiences to come to. We had a team of about 40 people, worked 24 hours a day, different shifts, and it was just an extraordinary, this is the facility. Each of these white things at the bottom is like a big sheet, and there's like an individual bay and an area, private area behind them. So that we're going to have to really keep in mind harm reduction. There are risks, but I think that once we roll this out into society in these ways, and maybe it's 20, 30 years, then we will have the Council for the Parliament of World Religions, and we will have peace next. Thank you.